Thanks very much, James. Let me just share my slides here. Yeah, thanks for the invitation too. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. Although it must be said, you've already heard a lot of the solutions, and I'm going to talk about some of the problems now. But I hope that this will be helpful in perhaps making the argument that some of the things you've already heard about in the last two talks will be really important. So, can you see those? Okay.
Yes, the slideshow's just started. I'll vanish now.
All right, thanks very much. Okay, let me just get my own face out of the way. So nobody wants to see that. There we go. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the problem of perverse incentives and a bit about what I feel can be done about them. Although I think you've already had two talks on what can be done about them, and I think they both have really excellent ideas. And there's going to be some overlap here as well. And I'd be, is this going to work? Yes, right. Okay. So I'd be interested to hear, obviously, everyone else's ideas on how we might combat these sorts of problems that we get. But it's going to be my argument in this talk that although some people have kind of pushed back a little bit and said, well, are you sure publish or perish really is that big a problem in science? I think there are issues in scientific research that only can be explained by the perverse incentive publish or perish system. So just recently, just a few months ago, the Daily Telegraph, this is a slightly confusing screenshot because it's a screenshot of the Guardian, but they're like have a screenshot of the Telegraph within their page. So the Telegraph announced that it was, and I don't know if they actually ever did this, but the idea was that they would link the pay that their journalists got with the popularity of their articles. And it was I just thought it was a perfect example of a perverse incentive, i.e. it's promoting the idea that you should get lots of clicks, you should get lots of attention to your article, rather than you should write a high quality article. You should write an article that reports on something important or useful or unique or something else. So a really nice classic perverse incentive in journalism there. And I think perverse incentives like that are everywhere you look. So clickbait, things like that in journalism. We see sort of short-termism in politics, where people are incentivized, where politicians are incentivized not to look at kind of long-term outcomes, but are very focused on the next election, which can often lead to very poor policies. You have teachers who are focused on getting their students past some arbitrary line in the for an exam result, for instance, and end up kind of slightly pushing the results. There's been various examples of that over the years, and social media as well. There's a great article that I linked to here, and you can have my slides after, about how social media tends to, instead of allowing us to have productive conversations, the incentive for social media people on social media and the companies themselves is to focus very much on the most rage-inducing things and just create this, as I'm sure you've noticed if you've ever been on Twitter or anything like that, this endless cycle of unproductive rage that you see. And we as academics think of ourselves as above these kind of problems. We think of ourselves as much better than journalists and politicians and so on. And we wouldn't have a system like this, but of course we do. We have a system where even though science is among the best things we've ever invented as a human race, academia, on the other hand, really is not. And we have a system that doesn't do what we want it to do in terms of promoting the best quality science. And this is a little comic that my friend Zach Wienersmith made. This is meant to be me talking about, and there's a big long comic that you can get at the link there, and it's about me talking about perverse incentives, and this is kind of where it starts. That this isn't a criticism of science in general; it's a criticism of the way we do it. And these are just a few of the things which I think we come to value in academia, and such as things like getting a big long CV with a publication count, getting citations and grant money, getting impact. Now that can be in the form of the impact factor of the journal that you're publishing in, or this weird and ill-defined concept of impact that our universities want us to have on the real world. which can range from, actually, treating patients with a disease to writing a blog post. And there's no real clear definition as far as I can tell, and the definition keeps changing. We value things like the flashiness, the novelty of research, the positive results, and the exciting, good stories rather than the less exciting ones. We value attention and fame and getting social plaudits from our fellow scientists and from the media and so on, and not necessarily. And by the way, a final thing which I think gets forgotten is that we value an easy life. We value avoiding awkward social interactions, for instance, by telling our colleagues that maybe this isn't the right way to do stuff, or they maybe got something wrong, or that actually I wouldn't do that, or I disagree with your idea, I disagree with your theory. I think that's not talked about enough, that a lot of the problems in academia and science in general come from just people just wanting to get along with each other, just trying to be nice to each other, and wanting to avoid awkward social situations where they disagree with people. And so, we value all those things. And in a perfect world where journals were really genuinely good quality filters for scientific results and so on, a lot of these things wouldn't matter. It would be good to value novelty and flashiness in a world where we knew that every novel and flashy finding was really robust. It would be good to value citations in a world where citations were genuinely people citing your work and thinking it was really important and so on. And it would be good to value the number of publications people have if we knew that those publications were all high quality. But unfortunately, we have this perverse incentive where we value these things in and of themselves rather than the things which they represent, which are things like, we want quality, we want rigor, we want reproducible results. Anyone should be able to come along and find the same results that you found on your data set. Anyone should be able to come along and find the same results in a different data set. The idea of replicability. We should value people trying to replicate other people's results, but we don't. We value novelty and excitement. We should value people sharing not just their data and their methods and so on, but also sharing the details of what they did. So openness and transparency and the sort of warts and all process of science that we forget about when we write papers, when often we want to make a good story and we want to make it look very clean and pristine and so on. And we don't necessarily value, boring but realistic results, right? A lot of the time you do an experiment and the result is quite boring, whether that's the experiment didn't produce the results that you predicted, your hypothesized. It produced an ambiguous mess of a result. We're not really told to value that. And in fact, often supervisors will tell their PhD students or their postdocs or whatever, and journal editors and peer reviewers will tell this to anyone submitting stuff, to say, well, you can try a different analysis on that. I'm not really interested in that result. That's a shame. That's a failed experiment. That didn't work out so well. So you need to push it in a different direction by trying something else. Try it a different way. And of course, we all know that if you try things a different way enough, you will find false positive results and less replicable results. And we end up in the replication crisis situation that I'm sure everyone is aware of. And I think one of the best quotes on this was Stephen Jay Gould in an article he wrote in the 70s in Science. He said, "I suspect that unconscious or dimly perceived finagling, doctoring, and massaging of data are rampant, endemic, and unavoidable. And this is my emphasis, in a profession that awards status and power for clean and unambiguous discovery." Right? This is what we're talking about today, and it's been known about for a very, very long time. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould was hardly the first to point this out, but that clean and unambiguous discovery really sticks with me, because we all know as scientists that when we do stuff, it's often not a clean and ambiguous discovery. It's often a very messy process, and we want to try and make that pristine when we write up our scientific papers or do our scientific work in general. So there's a really massive question of how we reward people for not necessarily just making clean and unambiguous discovery all the time. It's well worth reading that paper, by the way. And here's another black and white picture. This is Robert Merton, the sociologist who talks about the Mertonian norms of science. And these are the kind of, maybe we don't all follow them all the time, but they're kind of aspirational norms that we want to follow in science to to do good research. And one of them is universalism. It doesn't matter who came up with the result, what their socio-political demographic background is. It's just that they have produced a result, and we should pay attention to the results. Well, the incentives in science kind of push us back against that, because we care about where a result is published. We care about what university affiliation people had, how many citations they've had previously, what their H index is. So that whole idea of treating every single scientific result as a result per se is kind of at risk in a world where we have these incentives to value all these somewhat inherently valueless things. Disinterestedness was the other one. The idea that we shouldn't care how our results come out. We should have, I think Charles Darwin said, scientists should have a heart of stone in terms of their hypothesis. It really shouldn't be that we're wishing for something to come out the way the way we want. We should just want to know what the reality is. But in a world where positive results are pushed so strongly and are desired so strongly, that is at risk as well. The idea of communalism, I think he called it communism, but it's been called communalism in later stuff, because I think the word communism came to mean something somewhat different over the 20th century. But the idea is that we should be the results and the methods of science should be available to anyone. Anyone should be able to check. We should be sharing all our results and methods with each other all the time. But in a world where in the current world of academia, the incentives are very much to keep your research to yourself, because you want to, perhaps if you've collected a data set, you want to publish on that and not necessarily share it with everyone else. And also because you might have made mistakes in your research and you don't want the bad consequences of sharing those mistakes with the rest of the world. So communalism is at risk. And I think one of the biggest ones, and I've mentioned this briefly already, is the idea of organized skepticism. So science is a process of constant questioning and criticism and reviewing and changing your mind and so on. And of course, in a world where everyone's a bit too awkward to question their superiors, and in a world where we just really want an easy life by not necessarily getting into arguments and being disagreeable, the idea of organized skepticism, the very basis of science, is somewhat at risk. So and we can just get rid of Robert Merton altogether if we have a system like we have currently, which values all the stuff we talked about before, all these somewhat perverse or has all these perverse incentives. And I always like to show this graph, which I'm sure people have seen before, but this is kind of summarizes the problems you get in the scientific literature when you have the scientific system, the academic system, exerting a distorting influence on the stuff that we report. So this is a set of trials of antidepressant drugs, which about 50% were negative, that's the red ones, 50% were positive, that's the green ones. By the time, and these are the ones that were in the registry, by the time these actually get published in a journal, only about half of them are actually published. Only about half of the negative results are published, but almost all of the positive results are published. And this is real, by the way. This isn't some kind of simulation or something. This is a real study registry of antidepressant trials. By the time you actually read into the studies, you find that in many cases, a study that turned out negative has been the analysis has been changed somewhat to a different outcome to make it look like it was positive. So the thing they were originally looking at turned out to be negative. The drug didn't work, but they've shifted the measure somewhat. They've shifted the outcome so it actually looks more positive. That's the outcome reporting bias. And then, because we live in a system where the incentives are towards, again, still positive results and so on, even negative results get written up as if they were positive, get spun in such a way that makes it seem like they are they're positive, or promising in some way, when in actual fact they didn't turn out the way the scientists expected. And then to add insult to injury at the end, you have the studies that were positive get cited far more often in the subsequent literature than do the negative trials. So you have this process of, this is basically what I was talking about at the start. Science is a great thing. Here's the actual science going on at the left-hand side. Academia, not so good, because we filter it through this process, which basically launders away the negative results and turns them into positive results, or just disappears them entirely. So I think it encourages these bad practices, and these are the sorts of things we talk about, research integrity and so on. But I think there's also lots of other weird things that scientists do, or that crop up in science, that can't be explained except in a system of weird, perverse incentives. So here's another thing that scientists do, which is perhaps not the worst crime in the world, but it's just weird and as I say, only explainable in this strange system that we have in academia. So here's an example by Robert Sternberg, who is a scientist in my own field in psychology, who wrote, he was the editor of a quite big journal in the field, and added an editorial each time to each issue of the journal, and stuffed in tons and tons and tons of his citations. I think people looked through each of his editorials, and it was between 40% and 65%, I think, of the articles that were cited were Sternberg, were his own research. And he got in some trouble for doing this, because it was so egregious. But people do this an awful lot, and it, of course, dilutes the signal of, I've been cited a lot. Well, how many of those citations are just you citing yourself all the time? And there's some other examples there. Another thing academics do is self-plagiarism. One definition of self-plagiarism is self-plagiarism occurs when you fail adequately to cite your own work. In extreme cases, this is my emphasis, someone might attempt to publish exactly the same paper twice without noting that the paper has been previously published. Interestingly enough, the guy I mentioned in the last slide has also been doing this. So he was citing himself far too much in some articles, but also duplicating and not citing himself in other articles. So he had papers retracted a couple of years ago, because they were essentially exactly the same paper, but with a slightly different title. So I think this new model for school psychology was published in the journal School Psychology International, was exactly the same paper as a new model for cognitive education, which was published in the Journal of Cognitive Education. And actually also contains some elements of this other article as well. So they retracted the article for reasons of redundant publication. Another weird thing to do. Why on earth would you want to do this if you didn't have this huge incentive of boosting your CV substantially? And by the way, that quote from the top is, oddly enough, by Robert Sternberg himself, a year before these articles were retracted, writing in a kind of advice book for psychologists. Very, very strange. Explain that one, psychologists. Another thing scientists do is this thing, Slammy slicing, where papers which should be all one thing are published, are sort of spread across multiple different papers. So this is my favorite example, which is an example of a genome-wide association study in psychiatric genetics, where the researchers, instead of publishing all the human chromosomes together, we've got 23 chromosomes, they published a separate, and publishing them all together is the standard way of doing it. They published a separate paper for every single chromosome. Chromosome number 5, chromosome number 6, chromosome number 7, in different journals, splitting a paper which normally would be one paper into a potential 23 papers, which you've got to admire the brass neck on that. But again, it's a weird thing if we don't have this system of perverse incentives. And of course, we all know the fun of getting emails from predatory journals. Greetings, dear Dr. Richie Stuart J. A quaint is a raised area of choice for an international community of, I don't know, I don't really understand what any of this means. I just got this the other day. So I can submit articles to the Journal of Neurosurgery and Clinical Neurology, or the Journal of Medical Case Reports and Case Series, or the Journal of Community Medicine and Public Health Reports if I want. Impact factor 0.01. It's nice that they advertised that in there. And actually, weirdly, I don't know if anyone else has had this email, but they're now also predatory book writers. I'm an editorial assistant from Index of Sciences Limited, contacting you with reference from our editorial department. Basing on your outstanding contribution to the scientific community, we would like to write a book for you. Researchers like you are adding so much value to the scientific community, but no matter how many papers you publish in famous journals, you will still be unknown to common people. Well, thanks very much for that. This is another weird example of, I don't think these scams would exist if they didn't know that scientists were desperate for publications, desperate for exposure, and so on. They're serving a sort of target market, unfortunately. And then you get these really weird rings, like citation rings, where scientists all kind of agree in secret to always cite each other's work. And there's been some really interesting investigative investigations of these rings, where they find that these weird disproportionate citations are found in certain people's papers. And again, wouldn't happen if we didn't have this weird system. So what do we do about it? Let's briefly talk about this, and then I'd like to hear obviously what everyone in the audience thinks of this. But I mean, one of the things we can do is try and break this habit we have of being obsessed with new and exciting findings, or more specifically, break the link between those new and exciting findings and the decision to publish. Right? One of the problem is not that we like new things. It's great to like new things. The problem is that we only want to publish those new things, and we're far less interested in publishing null, negative, replication results or whatever it is. So one way is to change the whole way that we publish articles, and this is a registered report. You can find more details at the link there. Quite a few journals, I think several hundred journals, are now offering this idea of a registered report, where you, instead of writing the paper and then sending it to the journal, and the editor says, well, this is a positive result, so I'm far more likely to publish this, consciously or unconsciously, they may say that. In this case, you design the study, you develop the idea, and then you submit your idea to the journal. The journal says, well, if this is a good quality experiment, we'll publish it no matter which way the results come out, whether they're positive, negative, ambiguous, whatever, we'll publish it. Then you go off and do the experiment, and whatever way the results turn out, you can get yourself a publication. It breaks this problem of publication bias. It also breaks several of the other issues that we have in research. So I think things like that, changing the way that we reward. I mean, one of the rewards we should be talking about is not just awards that universities give to people and so on. One of the rewards is publication, right? So this is a way of giving people that hit that they get from publishing, but they get it whether the results are positive or not. We can also just explicitly reward the things we like. Implicitly, the system rewards, poor behaviors, but we can explicitly reward good ones. We've already heard. I'm not even going to go into all the details. We've already heard about hiring and promotion decisions and awards for open science and research culture. We need to think, and again, this is something which I'd love to chat about. We need to think about how to reward people who go out and actually review people's data, find problems, find issues in people's data, are skeptical, and so on. The current norm is that we don't pay peer reviewers, for instance, but perhaps we should think about ways of rewarding them rather than just listing their names in an article that no one ever looks at, which is the only reward peer reviewers currently get. Perhaps we should think about, even though it doesn't sound very nice, ways that we can deploy social motivations, including things like shame. Like, it's bad to make basic statistical errors or not be open, or to write a pop science book that misrepresents the field, or to write a paper where 40% of the citations are your own work. We shouldn't be afraid of saying that. And in fact, in some fields, the norm of criticism is different. I did a talk at an economics conference, and I had to. I actually was the critic. At the end of every single talk, they had someone come along and criticize the previous talk. That's the organized skepticism. And I think in some fields, people would run a mile before having someone specifically there to criticize them after the talk. But in some fields, this is much more of a norm. And I think if we can reward being critical, reward being saying to people, sorry, that's not, we value integrity. We don't value all these other things. Then that's going to be super important. And we've also briefly touched on the idea of apportioning credit. So I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm also running out of time, so I don't want to go into this either. But people are often selfish, and there's this great paper called 5 Selfish Reasons to Work Reproducibly, where the new kind of open science practices are cast in terms of, well, it actually makes it better for you if you can do these things. And the final point is that even just having this conversation like we're having now is changing the research culture, right? We can see that the idea of there being a crisis in science is much more, is very, very prevalent in the scientific literature compared to how it has been. We're having this conversation at every level, early and later careers. People just not being aware of these problems is a big part of the issue. And so just having events like this, I think, is super important. So I've been trying to get the word out, and getting the word out through events like this is super important. Oh yeah, just one more thing, which is, there are also, we don't want to create our own new set of perverse incentives where all these reproducible and open practices and so on become a box ticking exercise where we say, oh yeah, I've put a pre-registration up, and then you look at the pre-registration and it's not actually very good. Or, oh yes, I've shared my data, and oh, the data is a complete mess online and no one can use it. We don't want performative reproducibility, as Stuart Buck talked about a couple of weeks ago in this article in Nature. We want real improvements to quality. So we need to be aware that we could inadvertently create our own new system of perverse incentives if we're not careful. Perverse incentives are such a common thing for sort of human nature. So sorry, I slightly went on a bit too long there, but thank you so much for listening. Feel free to get in touch, and I'll be interested to hear your questions.
Stuart, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I mean, while I appreciate you speaking primarily from science and STEM perspective, I mean, I saw a lot of things echoed, say, in my own field in archaeology. And I also completely, I was smiling a lot when you showed the letters asking you to write articles and everything else, and sort of the vanity publishing for academics, book route and everything else. I mean, you just get on those main lists you can never need. I'm an archaeologist, but on one main list, because I wrote an op-ed for an obstetrics journal, I now get asked to publish in dozens of obs and gynae imaginary journals on a regular basis, and it's always very confusing to get the emails.
They will never stop emailing you.
Yes, I know, I'm there forever. I might as well bite the bullet and of course destroying the system from within. And the idea of challenges being built in is a really interesting one. It's a social science symposium, and after I submitted their paper, they said, thanks for that, we shared it with the person who's going to come along to demolish you afterwards. I'm like, what? But it actually was really productive, and she and I ended up collaborating on many things. It was fascinating. Nice. Okay, so we've had a lot of questions. Jennifer Blakely asks, do you see a role for ethics committees in helping address some of the challenges that you mentioned?
I saw quite a good tweet the other day about how ethics committees are passing the ethics committee is the minimal thing, not everything you can do to improve the quality of your research or the ethics of your research. And yeah, so I think ethics committees could, as well as saying yes, this is ethical research, they could potentially have built in ideas for how you could make the research more robust and reliable and so on, because it's hard to draw the line between treating participants in an ethical way in a psychology experiment where you're showing them unpleasant pictures or whatever it is that the ethics committees might worry about, or giving people drugs, whatever. And it's hard to draw the line between unethical research. Is it unethical to do to spend taxpayers' money on a study that is far too small to discover anything and underpowered, and you'll never actually make any scientific progress, and in fact you might even end up confusing people in future if you do this poor study. Yes, clearly that is unethical in some sense, and so maybe ethics committees should broaden their definitions. I don't know. It's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it in any great detail, but clearly there are ethical issues in doing bad research that don't just involve the sorts of things that ethics committees, IRBs typically deal with.
And also, there's the ethical duty to disseminate research, particularly if it's been funded by public money or is involved human or animal participants, for example. Okay, a couple of questions about preprints. Andrew Porter asked, would it be helpful to separate out the dissemination of the research record, i.e. preprints, from the promotion of that research by journals? And Richie asked, would it be sensible to link sort of the pre-registration and the grant application in some way to help drive change?
Well, I mean, it's on preprints. I think that's one of the kind of major ideas that's been kind of floating around for a while, is decoupling the idea of putting research out there with the idea of disseminating it. And so journals would, in that world, in a world where everyone just automatically preprints all their research, journals would become a kind of curation engine rather than someone who makes the decision as to whether results get out there into the world at all. And I think that has some merits, although as we've heard in previous talks today, we want to try these things out. We don't know what unexpected consequences, unforeseen consequences might come if we dramatically change the scientific system. But I like the idea of doing small scale trials of these things. We talked about the ethics committee thing. We talked about, let's not say, let's immediately change the system right now in a massive revolution. Let's try things on a smaller scale, see if they work, see what terrible incentives they produce, which I'm sure they would in many cases. But yeah, I like that idea of taking the decision out of the editor's hands. And, the editor can say, well, I think this is really good research and I'm going to promote it, but not necessarily I'm going to make the decision as to whether this reaches the light of day. And in that situation, you would have a kind of independent organization that does the reviewing. And I think there's been some moves towards that just recently. Can't remember what the name of the system is called, but Chris Chambers from the journal Cortex has been involved in something like that. There was also a question about pre-registration and grant applications. Certainly, I think the grant applications, there could be some interesting ideas of, you get your next bit of funding on the basis of having been open and reliable and so on, and publishing all your results. That has been the case with a few different organizations. I think Wellcome do this, and I think a couple of other places where if you haven't published everything, you don't get the last part of your grant income, to try and incentivize people to be 100% transparent with all their research. So I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but that's one idea that people have brought in, and it's an interesting idea of just withholding some of the rewards until people have done the stuff that we want them to do.
Thank you. A couple of points about peer review have been raised by some anonymous questioners. One person said, do we need to think about skills and competency development to help researchers learn how to criticize and feedback constructively, for example, in peer review? And also, another question, should peer review training be sort of more established to prevent the infiltration sort of poor reviewer habits learned by senior academics who perhaps find it harder to move away from the current cycle of perverse incentives? I
think it's a dramatically under-discussed thing, peer review. The quality of peer reviews, where I've had the whole range over the stuff I've published, the whole range of one-liners saying this is fine to huge, multi-thousand word reviews with really good details. And also, actually, it must be said, multi-thousand words, completely nonsense reviews as well. We rely, this is all stuff that's kind of behind the curtain in the vast majority of journals. We don't see this process. There are some journals now that are publishing the peer reviews, which I think is really important. But this is all kind of hushed up behind the curtain stuff. And yeah, we don't train anyone to be a reviewer. My PhD student the other day just got her first request to review an article because she'd published a paper. And she was saying, am I qualified to do this? Should I be doing this? And I was like, yeah, well, you should give it a go. So yeah, there's I don't think we have anything like the sort of conversations we need. And peer review is our filter, right? It's our method of trying to sort out the bad from the good stuff, and yet we don't really pay much attention to how it works in practice. And it's also in some ways our community engagement, because we think of peer review panels, grant review panels, promotion panels. These are things staffed by researchers, so sometimes they're not monolithic structures. We're just infiltrate them, we're part of them, so we can
think about our biases and competencies when we take on those roles, and perhaps work to affect change. And yeah, I mean, peer review is an odd one. Again, the amount of emails I get saying, "Hello, you're a gynecologist, review this paper." It's like, really? No. Okay, so
you could, right? I've realized this. I've said this before, but I sometimes have the really scary realization when I'm on the phone to a journalist, and I'll get the really scary realization that about a paper, I could say anything here, right? There's no one stopping me from saying anything about how important this research is or whatever. I could really say anything. And it's just a matter of like your own level of integrity that you don't. And clearly, some scientists do say anything, and they get these quotes in the news, and that's happened a lot during the pandemic. But it's similar to peer review. Like, you get a peer review request for something which you're not qualified to review, yet you're being given a lot of power there to make the decisions, even if you don't really have the statistical ability, for instance, or the subject knowledge or whatever. You often get the chance to review stuff. And so there's an interesting kind of ethical dimension to, do you take on a peer review to something where you want to help out, you want to help the editor because you know that it's really difficult to find peer reviewers, but you don't really know that topic that well? What decision do you make? Sorry, I
think on the individual level, it's about being self-reflective and also being aware of the limits of our competence. But there's the broader question of, are we teaching researchers what they need to know, or are we just leaving them to pick things up as they go along? And most training to learn how to be a good researcher happens in the context of a PhD or similar training at the beginning of your career. So how do you make sure people keep current? A question that came right at the beginning to talk about the Telegraph's proposal, at least from anonymous attendee, at least the Telegraph's idea of incentivizing users within the same newspaper. The current issue in the academic world is like comparing article views in a specialist magazine or local newspaper with a national newspaper because of the impact factor hierarchy. Should we do something about journal hierarchies?
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think hierarchies and so on are clearly, like, you look at some of the scandals that have happened, and again, just in COVID, with some of the biggest journals in the world having to retract articles based on complete nonsense data sets and so on, and that should shatter anyone's views of the hierarchy of journals, and there being these journals that are really trustworthy and so on. Everything has to be judged on its merits, and you should take no one's word for it ever, even if they're the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, and or whatever other journals have had to retract stuff recently, including, I was just reading about an interesting quantum computing result that had to be retracted from Nature. So the hierarchy is clearly very silly, and I think people are starting to realize that. On the other hand, it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? Because I've already talked about the predatory journals, where we know that they are at the bottom of the heap, and in fact are below the bottom of the heap, and you should never go anywhere near them, even if they do have an impact factor of 0.01. So we clearly have to have some way of judging whether a journal is worth publishing in or not. But I think that has to be on the basis of the papers that are published in it, rather than some magical property of the journal itself.
Thank you. Jill Curry says some funders already have publishing arms, but don't necessarily publish or promote the results of projects that are negative. So is there therefore a wider problem of reporting negative results amongst research society as a whole?
Sorry, I slightly missed that there.
So problems of publishing negative results or promoting the results of projects that are negative. So does that suggest there's a broader problem with this? And if something needs to be done, what could it be?
Well, I mean, I think the thing I mentioned earlier about like withholding funding until absolutely every result and possibly even data set is published from a project, I think it won't work in every case, but could work in some cases, to just make sure that all the stuff that's done. But I think a big part of this is the registered report idea, where instead of allowing scientists to just do all their research and then submit it to the journal, they have everything peer reviewed before they touch any of the data, and they make clear statements that I have not touched any of the data. I'm having these ideas on the basis of theoretical discussions, or maybe simulations, or using a subset of the data first rather than using the whole thing, or whatever. We're making these hypotheses, and then the journals agreeing whether negative or positive to publish them. And perhaps funders should be saying, we either strongly encourage or in fact require you to publish in this way with our research, because funders don't want to be, I always find it very strange. Funders don't want to be responsible for research that it gets retracted or is doesn't replicate or is low quality or whatever. But they never seem to get any of the blame. Really, it tends to be the journal, the journal, or the scientists themselves. People rarely say this wellcome funded research didn't replicate or whatever, but they should take some part of the blame as well if they've given money away to something which they've reviewed the grant and clearly it wasn't very high quality, and they should take some of the blame for that. So they don't want to be in a situation where they publish low quality research either.
Thank you very much. I think we'll close. These are all things to close, but just want to mention a comment from Nicola Wilson that came in saying when she's in that situation, being asked to peer review a paper that she's might not have the expertise to deal with herself, she isn't afraid to ask for help and contact the editor and say, or ask a second person to help to substantiate the error I'm not so familiar with. I want to highlight that comment because I think as researchers, we often feel we should know the answers, and it's a bad idea to admit we don't know the answers, and even worse to say, I need some help with this. I think that's a very good message to broadcast.
Completely agree. Totally.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I will draw things to a close now. I'd like to thank our speakers, Karen, who had to leave earlier, Stuart, who just finished, and Elizabeth, who spoke earlier about the University of Glasgow work. We've had 3 really interesting, insightful, thought-provoking presentations, each followed by some fascinating and lively discussion that certainly made me think. So thank you all very much for that. As we said earlier, the slides for the webinar will be circulated shortly, and the recordings, once they've kind of been chopped up into manageable chunks, will go up a little while after and be less known about that. So thank you, Karen, Elizabeth, and Stuart, for helping make this webinar great, and particularly thank you, the attendees, for your contribution, because it just wouldn't be the same without you. We hope you join us for our next webinar, which will be taking place in probably September, and we'll announce some details of that shortly. We'll be doing webinars on a bi-monthly basis now, and they'll remain free to attend and open to all, so do register and join us in the autumn. And finally, UKRE is an independent advisory body and a charity. Our work is supported by a small team of staff and a lot of volunteers. If anything today has got you fired up about issues of good research practice, research culture and thinking, what can we do to help? What can we do to change things? And you might be interested in volunteering with us. Please do get in touch. Details on our website, ukradio.org. So thank you all again very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and please do keep cool in this very hot weather. Take care, guys.